I'd like to talk about a style of acting which appears prominently in the John Wick films starring Keanu Reeves and in Point Blank starring Lee Marvin. This acting style has not much been valued in the history of cinema. I guess I should say in the history of cinema since the talking picture began. I call this kind of acting comic minimalism. Minimalism. It flourished during the silent film era and the great slapstick films of Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd. And it had a flowering in Lee Marvin's Point Blank and another flowering in Keanu Reeves's John Wick films. Uh, Chaz Stahelski, the director of the John Wick films, made it very clear that he was influenced by John Borman's film Point Blank and the acting of Lee Marvin in creating the John Wick character. And Keanu Reeves contributed greatly to the creation of the John Wick character. These films, John Wick films, have been very collaborative. Stileski has said so. Reeves said so as well. So, comic minimalism as an acting style. I want to begin by contrasting this style of acting with what I'm going to call traditional verbal acting. Comic minimalism being largely a non-verbal kind of acting. Traditional verbal acting. Well, first and foremost, this kind of acting is often evaluated based on line delivery. How is the line delivered? How is the character using language? What is the rhythm? What is the emphasis? What is the clarity? What is the emotion expressed by the language? And the second part of traditional verbal acting would be that the language becomes the vehicle of emotion. We evaluate the power of the performance, certainly based on gesture, but also the way that lines are delivered is a major part of how we value this kind of acting. And the very best the very best traditional verbal acting tends to involve an actor losing himself in a character to the point where we don't really recognize the character anymore. We can think of someone like Daniel Day-Lewis as an exemplar, a hero of traditional verbal acting. Again, I'm not saying that someone like Daniel Day-Lewis doesn't rely on gesture. He does beautifully, and his non-verbal skill is essential to his power as an actor. The same can be true of someone like Robert De Niro, another actor who is famous for losing himself in a character. And when I say losing himself in a character, referring to Day-Lewis and to De Niro, I mean transforming the body to the point where you can barely even recognize the person, Daniel Day-Lewis, Robert De Niro, playing the role. We can think of Daniel Day-Lewis, My Left Foot. We can think of Daniel Day-Lewis playing Hawkeye in Last of the Mohicans. We can think of Daniel Day-Lewis playing Abraham Lincoln, where the person that appears in the media as Daniel Day-Lewis seems to be lost in the character. And De Niro, the most famous example of his losing himself in a character would be when he plays Jake LaMotta in Raging Bull. But you can look at the history of the Academy Awards, and in the past 25 years or so, if a character loses himself in the role to be almost unrecognizable, the Academy goes wild. Brandon Fraser, The Whale, would be a great example. The performance is fantastic. I'm not in the least trying to shed negative light on that performance, but it's almost comical how, oh my gosh, he lost 40 pounds. Oh my gosh, he spent a year learning to paint. All this, the idea that that the best acting involves becoming something radically different than you appear to be when you are not acting. So, in um, contrast to traditional verbal acting, we can think of a non-verbal tradition of acting that isn't always comical, but it has its roots in comedy. And the most obvious example of comic nonverbal acting would be, well, Buster Keaton. Um, we measure his acting not by what he says, he's in silent films, but by what he does. He expresses emotion, he expresses ideas only through gesture, only through expression. So that's the main part of nonverbal acting. It simply isn't very verbal. And when we move ahead to other famous nonverbal actors, not only Lee Marvin in Point Blank, and not only Keanu Reeves in the John Wick films, but someone like Alain Delon in Le Samurai, the Jean-Pierre Melville film from 1967, or someone like Clint Eastwood in his Leone trilogy, The Man with No Name, For a Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. In fact, in a lot of Leone films, non-verbal acting reigns. We can think of how Once Upon a Time in the West, and the shots of the faces, the close-ups of the faces that Leone's really a master of. Language is not valued in his films like it would be in more traditional Hollywood films. So, nonverbal acting, first and foremost, emotion, ideas expressed through gesture, expression. One, two, nonverbal acting tends to be non-sentimental. If verbal acting is often measured by the power of the emotion, the way that the language expresses the emotion, non-verbal acting tends to be unsentimental. You can think of Buster Keaton, not so much Charlie Chaplin, who has a very very prominent sentimentalism, beautiful, like in City Lights, obviously. But Buster Keaton is famous for his deadpan, amazing stunts, chaos going on all around him, but his facial expression never changes. There's not an emoting, there's not a sentimentality to his acting, and the same will be true the same is true of Lee Marvin, Keanu Reeves. And interestingly, the nonverbal actors that I'm highlighting here, Buster Keaton would be one, Reeves, Marvin. We can put Alain Delon, Clint Eastwood. The actors tend to play the same role over and over, meaning there's not a loss of the actual self in the role. When you watch Clint Eastwood play the man with no name in those films, you're watching an actor play basically the same role over 3 films. And then when you hear Clint Eastwood interviewed, he often seems a little bit like this character. So the idea that the actor is in a way kind of playing himself. I mean, same with the Buster Keaton character. He's pretty much the same character. You see the General. You see Sherlock Holmes Jr. You see Three Ages. He's pretty much the same character. Think of Charlie Chaplin's The Tramp as well. And obviously, John Wick, over 4 films, is clearly the same character. But Lee Marvin kind of got typecast as well. When he was early in his career, he played these really nasty heavies, like in The Big Heat and in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. But after The Dirty Dozen in '67 and The Professionals around the same time and Point Blank, he kind of became Lee Marvin in that, oh, let's go see a Lee Marvin film because we're going to see Lee Marvin play Lee Marvin. Some people don't value that kind of acting. Some people say things like, oh, well, he's just playing himself, as if that's not acting. Humphrey Bogart, same in every film. Cary Grant, kind of the same in every film. Tom Cruise film. I feel like that kind of acting is undervalued. I feel like to create a character and the character remains attractive and interesting and engaging over several films. To me, that's an incredible feat of acting. That basically who you are, who you have constructed as a character who seems kind of close to who you actually are when you're not acting. Maybe the role and the actor are quite different, but sometimes it appears that Clint Eastwood's kind of the same when he's on screen or not. To me, that's an amazing feat. To kind of create a role that is yourself, Clint Eastwood, Lee Marvin, Keanu Reeves, and remain interesting from film to film to film to film. That shows a great charisma. It shows a great personal attraction. It shows to me great acting talent. So then, I've really tried to draw a distinction between verbal and nonverbal acting, and haven't really talked much about comedy yet. But now, I'm going to move to comedy. This what I'm calling comic minimalism. I want to talk about now, and I really want to focus on the films Point Blank, John Wick. When you watch Point Blank, 1967, directed by John Borman, you see a character named Walker who doesn't have much to say. He's laconic. He often stays silent when others around him are talking. You see a character whose history is not clear. We don't really know Walker's history at all. All we know is that he was betrayed by his best friend and his wife, and he's trying maybe to seek revenge for that. But he doesn't have much of a history. He doesn't say very much. He's very focused in what he's doing. He's trying to recover $93,000 that he thinks his best friend owes him from a robbery they pulled off. And when he is violent, he is directly and brutally and violent in a virtuosic kind of way. He's very effective as a violent person. But also with the Walker character, there's a melancholy underlying the silence. It seems as if his silence is trying to mask some vulnerability or softness or pain. And we know that he is suffering because his best friend and wife betrayed him, and his best friend shot him and left him for dead. So there's a complexity to the laconic nature of Walker's character. Now, where does the comedy come from? I think in two ways. One way that Walker expresses comedy in Point Blank, and Point Blank is not a laugh out loud kind of movie. It's not in the comedy section, nor is John Wick. They would be in the action section of well, we don't have video stores anymore. But you get what I'm saying. Deadpan. And deadpan is a mode of comedy where the expression on the face seems radically disproportionate to what's going on around the person with the expressionless face. So there's a gap between the face of no emotion and the situation which would seem to call for extreme emotion. So we see Walker in Point Blank in highly charged emotional situations, highly charged physical situations with violence, and his face is the same. He's not expressing much emotion at all. And this can be comical, that disproportion between expression and situation. It's ironic, and that irony has a kind of comedy to it. So that's one mode of comedy in Point Blank. The other is the opposite. I would call it the comedy of excess, where sometimes Walker is so extreme in his violence toward people, or strangely enough, toward machines. He's extremely violent toward a car during a test drive, where he's interrogating a car dealer to try to get some information, and the dealer's in the passenger seat, and Walker's just totally bashing this car all to hell. There's another scene where Walker in anger shoots a phone instead of the man near the phone. So that excess, like that's too much violence. that's outsized. It's hyperbolic. That also can be comical in the film. Neither mode of comedy in this comic minimalism deadpan, excess, require language. And we see this kind of comedy in John Wick. And I would say the John Wick films are funnier than Point Blank. And to me, the John Wick films become more comical as we move through them. I think Stilhesky, he says he's influenced by the great silent film slapstick comedies. He said his dad had a collection of 8 millimeter versions of a lot of Harold Lloyd films, Chaplin films, Keaton films, and his dad would just run these films in a loop for hours. So Stileski soaked these films up. But also Stileski says that musicals, great Hollywood musicals, are influence on the John Wick films. Like the Busby Berkeley, these kind of crazed, dreamy dance sequences shot from above, where bodies don't look like bodies anymore. They just look like sort of gracefully moving particles. Also, Gene Kelly, say Singing in the Rain, or Fred Astaire, say Top Hat, very much influencing the John Wick films. How are John Wick films like musicals? Because musicals are not about anything but themselves. You go see a musical not necessarily to get a meaning or to think about a theme. You go to watch people move. You watch bodies in motion, bodies beautifully in motion. And we see that very much in the John Wick films in a way that the Point Blank does not even approach. I mean, the martial arts virtuosity in these John Wick films give a kind of lightness and lilt to the picture, even though the violence is severe. But the violence is so excessive to where there's a way in which that becomes meaningless to a certain extent. So the excess in John Wick is much more excessive than the excess in Point Blank, where, I mean, you think of the famous scene where Wick is moving his way up the steps to reach the Sacre-Cœur for his duel, and assassin after assassin after assassin after assassin after assassin after assassin comes after him. It becomes kind of absurd. It becomes ridiculous. It becomes funny. And earlier in the film, where he's moving through the city, the cities, I mean, same sorts of things, where these assassins are coming out from everywhere. Stileski said he was also influenced by Walter Hill's great film The Warriors, where we see this gang from Coney Island try to make its way back to Coney Island, being attacked from almost every block by a different kind of gang. So the excess of Wick's violence in the film is over the top. But also Wick has that deadpan. He barely speaks. All this extreme violence and all these extreme emotions are going on around him, and he remains totally calm, totally stoic, as if he's wearing a mask almost. And that disproportion, I think, lends a comedy to the John Wick films as well. Now, just to complete the comparison with Walker in Point Blank, as I said, Wick shares with Walker the nonverbal acting, shares with Walker, well, you don't really know what his history is. What is John Wick's history? All we know is he has a wife who died and a dog that was killed. And that's all we know. So same with Walker. We don't know much about his history. There's not much sentimentality at all in Wick, not much sentimentality at all in Walker, as I've said. But also, like Walker, there's a melancholy to John Wick. This is a man who has lost what he loved. This is a man who does not take joy, certainly, in what he has to do. It's a man who is empty, but yet desires fullness. So I think that ultimately John Wick, the 4 films are moving, and I think that Point Blank is also a moving film because it's about men who deep down seem vulnerable and who seem to wish they could be doing something else, and who do not relish their skill in violence, but they must be violent to survive. They also seem at a certain point to see this whole situation as absurd. The violence isn't meaningful necessarily. It's absurd. And absurdity, as Camus tells us in many places, Yes, it's painful because it's based on a gap between what you want and what is, but also absurdity is darkly funny. And in this regard, the comic minimalism we see in John Wick, all four films, and then we see in Point Blank, um, is dark, but it's dark in a way that is deeply and meaningfully and movingly comical.